free will and determinism is our next big theme, next big topic. I really like this one. This one's really good, discussing in class, which we unfortunately can't do. People always have a lot to say on this topic. It just touches on so many different areas of our lives, I think, and it's just an interesting topic. Well, I'm going to do this the best I can. So look at the painting. Do you recognize what's going on there? Yeah. There's a snake right here. There's an angel. Two people who look really bummed out. This guy doing a facepalm to his own actions, I think. Well, this depicts an angel kicking out Adam and Eve out of paradise, right? Out of the Garden of Eden, because they disobeyed God. And oftentimes in Christian theology, there's a classic question, a classic problem for theism, for the idea that God exists, that we'll look at later in more detail. But that problem is the existence of evil and suffering in the world. And why is there suffering in the world? Why are our lives so hard? Why do our children sometimes die before they can even live a whole life? Why is there so much pain, so much anguish in the world? How is that compatible with a loving God who has the power to stop it? It's a powerful question, and it's a difficult one to answer, especially when you consider things like, again, children are the worst, are really the worst thing to think about here, right? Think about children who are abused by adults. And the idea is that God does not intervene because God has given us free will. And it was free will that got Adam and Eve kicked out of paradise. It was free will and making the wrong choice that led to all this pain and suffering. So for many Christians, you can trace evil and suffering and pain back to this event, sometimes called the fall of mankind, right? That everything was perfect before, but God gave Adam and Eve free will, told them, don't eat from that tree. You can eat from all the other trees, but don't eat from that one. And then they did it anyway. They listened to the talking snake. And so the idea is that because humans used free will to disobey God's command, that is now why there is pain and suffering in the world. That is why we don't live in paradise. Right? So free will is here very important because it's supposed to explain this great looming question: why so much suffering? Why so much apparently needless suffering? And the answer that theism, traditional religious theism, gives is free will. And that's the reason. It didn't have to be this way, but since we chose wrongly, we deserve what we got. So free will, it's an important concept, right? In this very cosmic sense. So we're going to look at the idea of free will. What do we actually mean by that? And then we're going to look at the relationship between free will and morality. And as you'll see, these are tightly interlinked. Right? There's a huge link between free will and morality. Okay. Then we're going to look at the idea of determinism. Determinism is the idea that everything has a cause. Nothing could have gone any other way than it did. If you rewind the tape of the universe, right, is one way to put it, and play it again, it's going to all happen exactly in the same way. Because every event is causally determined by previous events. Things can only go one way. So many people think that this is correct, And then the question is, what does that mean for free will? If determinism is true, if every event is predetermined by previous events, what does that do to our concept of free will? Many people think that determinism and free will can't both be true. That view is incompatibilism. So many people think that if determinism is true, then we don't have free will. And if we have free will, then we don't have then determinism is false. So incompatibilist thinks it just can't be both. We can't have it both ways. So if you're an incompatibilist who believes in free will, well, then you think determinism must be false. Right? That makes you a libertarian. Not libertarian in the political sense, the political party. It has nothing to do with that. Right? Get that out of your head. But liberty is still at the root word, right? Liberty, freedom, free will. Right? So a libertarianist is a free willist. But a libertarian is someone who believes in free will and not determinism. Right? Because they think they're incompatible. They can't both be true. Whereas if you're a hard determinist, then you also think they're incompatible, but you think determinism is true. So a hard determinist is someone who says determinism is true, and guess what? That means we do not have free will. Okay. But then there's another view, and it's interesting, this view often gets ignored, even though in philosophy it's one of the more popular views. Outside of philosophy, people do like to discuss this problem, but they tend to be either just a hard determinist or a libertarian. Well, a compatibilist is someone who says, yes, determinism is true. Every event is causally determined or necessitated by previous events. But that doesn't mean that our concept of free will is now completely useless. If we just try to think about what we really mean by free will and what it needs to mean in order to have a sense of morality, then we'll see that they're not actually incompatible. We can actually have it both ways. It's just free will might not mean exactly what you had hoped that it would mean. Right? Yeah. So I'm going to spell all of this out. I just wanted to give you a general layout of what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so let's talk about free will itself first. What do we mean? Well, I'm avoiding giving some sort of really tight, abstract definition with sufficient and necessary conditions. But at least it's associated with a few different phenomena, right? For one, we tend to think that doing something of your own free will means you can choose between different alternatives. You have different choices, and nothing is pushing you one way rather than another. Right? No one's putting a gun to your head, right? For example, if you enlisted in the army because of your own free will, then it's because you chose to. You could have not. You could have avoided it. You could have made some different choice, but that's the choice you made, right? And you weren't forced into it. You're in control of the action. The action is voluntary, is another way of putting it. And as you'll see, some of these things that I'm associating with free will, there will be some overlap as well. Okay, just different ways of saying the same thing in some cases. You're in control of the action, right? So a sneeze, for example, we don't say a sneeze is something you did of your own free will. It's usually involuntary. In most cases, you can't stop it, and you certainly didn't intend to do it, right? So the action is voluntary. I'm going to give you another example in just a little bit, but I'll give you a little preview now. Think, for example, suppose I have a muscle twitch that happens to me sometimes. There's some sort of spasm. I have a neurological disease or something like that, and sometimes my hand just goes like that. Okay? That's different from me without that neurological disease just intending to raise my hand on purpose. I've used that example a lot for philosophy of mind, but that's the whole idea, right? This action is the result of my intentions. That makes it a free will action. Right? I freely chose to do this. I'm in control of my arm. That's free will. But if I have some sort of muscular condition, some sort of thing that makes my arm twitch beyond my control, well, then we don't call it free will. It's some sort of involuntary behavior. Right? This ties in with the idea that you meant to do the action. Right? It was deliberate, on purpose. Right? So I want to raise my hand, and now up my arm goes. Right? As opposed to, oh, my neurological thing is kicking in again. That's not deliberate. That's not on purpose. But if it's a free will action, then it's something you meant to do. A burglar, for example, right? They get in trouble because they meant to do that. They meant to break into someone's house and take their stuff. That was part of the intention. That's part of the reason that they get punished if they get caught. It wasn't just an accident. They didn't just fall into the house and fall back out with a bunch of stuff. Right? That does not happen. So that's part of why we say that the burglar is morally and legally responsible or culpable, is because they meant to do that. It wasn't some sort of accident. Right? So free will is important in that sense. Right? Did they do it of their own free will? Meaning, did they mean to do it, or did something else cause them to do it? Okay, the fourth one, and this is really going to be the really important one. This has a couple of different ways of reading this statement, and that's going to end up making the difference between incompatibilism and compatibilism. Okay, I'm going to say that again. This idea right here, how you interpret this statement, is going to end up making the difference between compatibilism and incompatibilism. One way of reading it will turn you into an incompatibilist, and another way of reading it will turn you into a compatibilist. Okay? So it's the idea of having alternate possibilities. The idea that you could have done something other than what you chose to do. You could have chosen not to enlist in the army. So really, this does tie in very much with this first one, right? It's the idea that there are alternatives, and it's not just that those alternatives were available and you ended up choosing one thing. It's also, this is saying that you could have done any of those other ones. That it was completely up to your free will, right? Do I want to get into the different ways of reading it yet? Yes or no? Well, I guess I will, and if it's not clear right away, then maybe it'll be clear later. Okay, so I will talk about it right now, but then it'll come up again later. Okay. So there's two different ways of reading this. What do you mean you could have done something other than what you chose to do? What exactly do you mean by that? So you could have chosen not to enlist in the army. Does that mean, let's say there's a crucial moment where you're about to sign up and you're really thinking about it. Do I really want to do this? And you decide, you go over all the pros and cons again, and you think, no, this is really the best option. I'm going to do it. I'm going to sign up for the army. Okay. So what does it mean then to say that you could have chosen not to? If we rewind the tape of time, right? If we just rewind all of time to that crucial moment again when you're deciding, in what sense could you have chosen not to? Well, in this sense, at least, you could have chosen not to if, when you went through that list of pros and cons, you came up with some reason to say, well, no, actually, I shouldn't join the army. Okay. But of course, that's not what happened. You already had all your beliefs in your head, you went through them, and then you decided to enlist in the army. So, could you have chosen not to, even though you had the same beliefs and the same desires? That's one way to read it. That if you rewind the tape of time and all the conditions are exactly the same, you go through that pros and con list again, and you again come up with the idea that you should do it, therefore you do it. Right. If things are exactly the same, could you have done otherwise? Or are you just saying, if we rewind the tape of time, but in this time, your thinking is slightly different about it. This time you end up with different beliefs, different desires, and you end up doing something else. You end up non-enlisting in the army. And those two are very different. And let me go through that again. If you rewind time to that crucial moment where you're deciding to enlist for the army, and let's suppose you have the exact same psychological profile. You've got all the same beliefs, all the same memories, all the same desires. You're the same person with all the same thoughts. You could still do something different. That's one way to read it. That even if you have the exact same psychological profile, you might end up doing something completely different. You might end up choosing not to enlist in the army. Or you mean, if we rewind time, but your psychological profile is slightly different. You have slightly different beliefs, slightly different desires, then could you choose to do otherwise? So if you think it's the first, if you think that's necessary for free will, then you're going to end up being an incompatibilist. If you think that having free will means that if you rewind time and you're in that crucial moment of making a decision and you have the exact same psychological profile, the same thoughts are going through your head, but somehow you end up making a different choice. If that's what you mean by you could have done otherwise, that's going to make you an incompatibilist. Whereas if you say could have done otherwise, that just means if you went back to that point in time and your mind had been slightly different, then you could have made a different choice. Nothing compelled you one way or the other. Right? So in either way, there's no compulsion going on. But in the one case, we're saying you only could have done otherwise if your mind state had been slightly different. Because otherwise, the argument goes, it just doesn't make sense. Why would you have a different outcome to your thought processes if your thought processes are exactly the same? But the stronger reading says, no, even if your thought processes are the same, even if your psychological profile is the same, that crucial moment, that decision could go either way every time. Okay. Maybe that's not clear yet, everything that I just said. Maybe it'll become clear. But for now, just think of this. We're going to associate these things with free will. Right? If one of these does not hold, then maybe it's not free will. These are all pretty straightforward, right? The ability to choose, and you're not being made to choose one choice or another. Being in control, the action being voluntary, your meaning, intending to do it, it's deliberate, it's on purpose, and you could have done otherwise than what you chose to do, right? So these are all pretty straightforward, but this last one, I just want to remind you, there's two different ways of interpreting this, and we'll get back to that. But I just want to say that this is the important one. It's really the key to the whole puzzle, I think, anyway. Okay, but for now, just sort of think, okay, free will, we mean something like this. An action is a free will action if it involves this. A person has free will if they can do this, if they can do these four things. Okay, so there's a huge link between free will and moral responsibility, right? You can look at it in terms of reasons versus causes here. So that neurological disorder that I was talking about earlier, that makes me go like this sometimes. Well, what if you're in the way and I slap you, right? And this is the face you make. Right? This person making the face does not have the neurological disorder. I just want to make that clear. Right? It's me with my hand here. It accidentally flopped around because of my neurological disease, and it slapped you and it hurt you. Something caused me to slap you. It's my neurological disease. Right? I didn't mean to do it. I didn't intend to do it. It wasn't deliberate. It was involuntary. It wasn't a free will choice that I made to slap you. Right? As opposed to, well, maybe I slapped you because I don't like you. Well, that's a reason for slapping you. That means it's on purpose. That means it's deliberate. That means it's voluntary. And that means I formed an idea in my head to slap you for some reason, and then I did it. So we distinguish between reasons and causes. Did you act for a particular reason that you had in mind? Well, then you are morally responsible. But if it was caused by something outside of your own intentions, like a neurological disease that makes your muscles spasm at unfortunate times, and that sometimes causes you to slap people, then it's totally different. Right? We would not hold this person morally accountable in the same way that we would hold this person morally accountable. Right? We might still, if this is a problem that keeps happening, maybe you'll start demanding that I always maintain, a COVID rule, distance away from you, always be 6 feet away from you, so this doesn't happen again and again and again. So we might still hold them morally responsible, but if it's just that one time, if we're comparing these two different cases where just once I accidentally slapped someone because of this thing, versus me slapping you because I don't like you, because I meant to do it. Well, this person, the person who meant to do it, is obviously morally responsible and morally blameworthy, right? We would say things like, well, that's not a very good person. You can't just go around slapping people. That's immoral in some way. It's versus this. And so we assign blame and praise accordingly, right? It just sort of depends on whether or not it was caused by something outside of your intentions, or if it was caused by your intentions, if you meant to do it, right? So the difference between praise and blame, between blame and praise has to do with that, right? Do you blame? Do you blame this person? No, you don't. Right? You blame this person because they did it of their own free will. They did it because they meant to. It was voluntary. Okay? Think of other examples. Think of a kitten gets stuck in a tree. That we just looked at blame. Let's look at praise. A kitten gets stuck in a tree, and somebody sees the kitten, and very, very high up. It's a bit dangerous to go up there, but they do it. They get up there. They rescue the kitten. They're a big hero for rescuing the poor little kitten. It was a risky thing to do, but they care about the animal's life. Okay. Praiseworthy, right? They meant to do it. They thought it was the right thing. They recognized the danger, but they thought it was worth it. It was the right thing to do. Well, we tend to praise a person like that. We think, oh, good job. What a hero, Or at the very least, what a nice stand-up person. Yeah, we might assign some sort of praise for the person. But now imagine, it's not that difficult, hearing Eureka, to imagine somebody's tweaking, right? High on meth. They climb a tree. Right? They've got that super meth power. And they climb up the tree. And while they're up there, maybe they take a little rest for a second. Maybe they fall asleep. They wake up, do a little more meth. They've got the energy to climb down. Well, in that whole time that the meth head was sort of lying there, cats jumped on their back. They didn't even notice. And the meth head climbs back down. The kitten jumps off their back. Okay, that person, in some way, you could say, rescued the kitten. But we're not going to say, oh, what a good person for rescuing the kitten. No, because they didn't form any intentions of doing it, right? It was just an accident. It wasn't because they did it deliberately, as opposed to the person in the first example, where they meant to do it. So the method is not praiseworthy for rescuing the kitten. The other person is. Again, because of the difference between choosing to do something of your own free will, deliberately doing it, voluntarily doing it, meaning to do it. Okay, so this has led lots of philosophers to sort of adopt this principle of alternate possibilities. Right? The idea is that you're only morally responsible for an action if you could have done otherwise. Remember that could have done otherwise that we just looked at. It's a tricky phrase because there's multiple ways of interpreting it. And the idea is you're only morally responsible for an action if you could have done otherwise. Right? Think of Adam and Eve couldn't have chosen otherwise. Then would it be fair that caused about the fall of mankind and that caused evil and suffering to enter into the world? It's difficult to see how that would be fair if they couldn't have done otherwise than what they did. Right? See the problem there? Right? So the idea is that you're only morally responsible for an action, right? Either in a good way or in a bad way, right? Whatever, if it's an immoral action or a morally good action, you're only responsible for it. You're only going to be held accountable for it if it was a real possibility that you could have chosen to do something different. If you couldn't have chosen to do anything different, then you're not morally responsible. That's what the principle of alternate possibility says. Intuitively, that makes a bit of sense, right? You know, I mean, you might defend yourself by saying, I didn't have any choice. I couldn't have done anything else. That would get you off the hook, presumably. But if you could have done otherwise, then you're morally responsible. Okay, so keep this in mind. Okay, I'm going too fast. So all we've done so far is we've looked at free will and what it is. It's something like, a person has free will if they can deliberately, voluntarily choose an action from among a variety of choices, and if they could have chosen a different choice than the one that they made. Okay? And then here, that ties in with morality. Right? That it's only free will actions that we hold one another morally responsible for. It's only free will actions that get blame or praise. And free will actions here specifically meaning actions that could have been otherwise. Okay, so now to determinism. Right? This is the big problem. Everything is, hunky-dory so far, right? This all hopefully makes sense at some intuitive level. That, yeah, we do have this concept of free will that we use both in evaluating people morally, but also in terms of legal action, right? This is a huge thing in court, is whether or not something is voluntary or involuntary. It's very, very important. So we have this sort of ordinary concept of free will that we use, and we seem to need it to distinguish between people who are blameworthy and not, or praiseworthy or not. Right? So it seems like it's an important concept, and we have an intuitive sense of it, and we all seem to rely on it to some extent, at least to the extent that we think things like, no, you didn't have to do that. You could have chosen something differently. Right? The fact that you made that choice makes you morally culpable, makes you morally blameworthy. So this is all supposed to just capture our everyday concepts of free will, the one we rely on regularly. So this is not just a philosophical theory here. This is supposed to capture sort of our folk theory. Remember the idea of a folk theory? Our everyday conception of free will and the way that it ties in with morality. Determinism comes in to potentially destroy all this. So we'll look at 3 different arguments for determinism. The first 2 are actually pretty similar, but this first one is more of a philosophical argument based on just intuitive principles, and then the other one's a little more scientific, a little bit more empirical. All right, so causal closure. It's the idea that every event in the physical world has a sufficient cause or set of causes in the physical world. Right? So anything that happens here in the physical world around you, if there's some sort of event, it must have been caused by a previous event. Yeah. So that's to say that for any physical event Q, if P caused Q, then Q necessarily follows P. So that means if we have P, and we say that it caused Q, if P really is the cause of Q, then that means that whenever you get that P, you're going to get the Q. Yeah. Q necessarily follows P. So every event in the physical world is like that. It's got a bunch of causes in the physical world, and if those causes that themselves are events, right? If those causes are there, then they bring about those events. They determine them. They necessitate them. And that's what this is saying. Q will necessarily follow P. If P really is the cause of Q, then that means that P makes sure that Q comes about. So that means that all physical states are causally necessitated by previous physical states. Go a bit fast there. Let's see. Let me give an example to make this more concrete. Here we go. Here's this tub thing. Tupperware thing. Okay. And here I've got a little rock. And I'm going to drop it and let it go. Okay. Now, this little rock, this little gem thing, took a particular physical path down. What we're saying here, causal closure says that event, the path it took, can be entirely explained by all the physical stuff that's happening around it. For example, the angle of this, the texture of this, how much gravity is pulling down, where I place it when I let go of it, how much I move while this is happening, how much air resistance there is, or other interferences going on. All of these combine to explain exactly why it took the path that it did. And notice every time it's going to be a slightly unique path, right? I can do this over and over. There's a physical event, and we can explain that physical event entirely just by all the physical stuff happening around it, right? We don't need to go beyond that, do we? We don't, right? There's nothing supernatural going on. There's just the physical world, physical causes, things like gravity, the angle of this, where I'm letting it go, the texture of the Tupperware, how much I'm moving. There's all these physical factors that are involved that explain and determine the path that it takes. So even though to us the path is random, we can't exactly predict it, we know that the reason it takes that path down is because of all those physical factors happening. So once I set it up like this and I let go, then it's completely determined which path it's going to take. There's no could have done otherwise for this guy. Only one thing is going to happen, given those physical conditions, right at the beginning of its descent. Right now, everything from when I said now to where it is now, that whole path it took down, how fast it went, everything completely determined from the time that I let go of it. So every event is like that. Every event in the physical world has a physical explanation in that sense, right? By looking at the prior physical states of the world. If that's too physicalist for you, if you were maybe a dualist or something like that, and you think there's more to the world than the physical, we could still appeal to causal closure. We could just say that every event has a sufficient cause, whether it's physical or non-physical. It just means that if an event happens, there's some sort of causal explanation. Events don't just happen out of nowhere. They have an explanation. And that explanation, whatever it is, that's enough to bring about that event. It's sufficient. That means if the cause happens, the event or the effect necessarily follows it. You know? So this is just supposed to be appealing to your intuitive sense that things have explanations, that things have a causal story in terms of why did that particular event happen in that way. And we can see that most clearly in this example. Why did it take that particular path? Again, it has to do with all those physical factors. You can do this for any kind of event. A bunch of stuff happened right before it that caused it to be that way. So that's an argument for determinism, right? I hope you see that, because it means that whatever happens is causally necessitated by what happened before. So on that view, the little rock example, the path that it takes down the slope of the yellow container, the way that that's completely determined by previous physical causes, my behavior is physical as well, and it's going to fit into this picture as well. So each of my physical movements is completely determined and necessitated by the state of the world prior to those movements. Why did I choose to raise my hand? Well, if you're a physicalist, right, we've looked at physicalism in the philosophy of mind, then of course it makes sense. My intention was just a bunch of brain activity anyway. Brain activity, it's a bunch of electrical signals, and we know that that happens. Those electrical signals get sent through the nervous system, and up goes my arm. Ask a biologist about all the actual science of that. But that's the idea, is my physical movements are caused by other physical movements that happened prior. So my raising my hand is caused by all these brain states that are telling my arm to go up. Those brain states were caused by other brain states and by things from the environment. Right? Definitely just think of functionalism here. Every event is caused by some other event. Everything has some sort of causal explanation, and that is going to include your actions. So in this view, your actions are all causally determined by other events. So causal closure here, all it really does is, maybe you have an intuitive sense that free will is true, but people also have an intuitive sense that this is right, that things don't just happen with no explanation. And if that's the case, then it looks like every event, every physical event, has some sort of physical cause. If you want to move beyond physicalism, we could still say, well, every event has some sort of sufficient cause, so maybe it wasn't my brain states that were causing my arm to go up, but it's the state of my soul, my soul state. Well, what explains that soul state? Why is your soul in that state? Well, something must have happened prior to it, right? You had a certain set of experiences, for example, that caused you to have that soul state. So you don't get out of it by saying that the world is not just physical. Right? So even a dualist presumably is going to agree that events have causes, whether those causes are physical or non-physical. But once you agree that events have causes and that the causes determine the effects, that's determinism, right? Now, hopefully you can already see why this might pose a problem for our ordinary idea of free will. Not necessarily, though. Okay. Physics gives us another reason to think that determinism is true. Here the idea is, well, everything in the physical world is composed of these elementary particles, and those elementary particles always obey strict physical laws. Right, so go back to this. This has a certain molecular composition. It's composed of a bunch of elementary particles that ultimately explain why it has this texture. Right? This same thing over here. Ultimately, the structure is explained by the particles that compose it. All the particles obey these strict physical laws. Right? If the world is in this state at this time, all the particles are over here. All the particles that compose everything, they're in this particular state. Well, then there are laws that dictate that if they are in this state at this point, then they will be at this state at this point. So this is a famous example here. LaPlace was a physicist a couple of centuries ago, right? Remember, this is on the heels of the scientific revolution. We're really starting to understand the world scientifically. And his idea was, I'm not going to read all this, his idea was, well, look, we can predict a lot already just by referring to scientific laws. We can predict a lot based on what the world is like at this point, and then we apply a physical law, and we say, well, it's like this, then the physical law says that this must happen afterwards. Well, what if you had a mind that could comprehend the entire state of the physical universe at this point, and then also understood all the laws that govern events in the physical world? Then you would be able to predict exactly what's going to happen next, right? Because everything is determined. Everything follows these universal physical laws. Right? All the little particles at this point in time will tell us how those particles will be arranged the next moment of time. That's what those laws tell us. That's what they allow us to do. So if a mind was large enough to be able to comprehend the entire state of the universe right now, and knew all the physical laws which govern the universe, then they would be able to know exactly what the state of the universe will be like next. Yeah. Look at this example here. Right? If we look at the world, not the way we normally look at it as medium-sized objects, right, or big-sized objects, but don't look at it through the filter of what defines an object functionally, like a pen supposed to write. Right? Just think of all the stuff around you is just a bunch of particles. Right? There's air all around you; those are particles. There's chairs; those are particles. There's pens; those are particles. There's all these particles. So the universe, we can think of it as just a field of elementary particles. And now, why is the universe like this at this time? Well, it's because just prior to it, it was like this. And the physical laws explain how this transitions to this state. So everything, all the entire universe thought of as elementary particles is explainable by the state of the universe just prior to it. And that what that means is that this state of the universe means that this state of the universe is going to come about. This causes this. This state is causally determined by this. This state could not have been otherwise than what it is. It's completely necessitated by the state of the universe at this point in combination with the laws of physics. Yeah. So that's the sort of the argument from physics, the idea that ultimately everything is a bunch of elementary particles that always obey these strict laws. And so if you somehow knew where all the particles were, then you could predict their trajectory, and so you could predict future states of the universe. So that's another argument for determinism, right? Okay. Well, if those two are not convincing, then maybe this one will be. This might be actually the best one, in a sense, because it's slightly more intuitive and slightly more obvious if you think about it for a little bit. And that's the idea that all that conscious, intentional behavior that we were talking about, right, things that we associate with free will, those are all explained by your beliefs and your desires. What beliefs you have about the world and what it is that you want or value. Those govern your behavior. But those are ultimately out of your control. Okay, let me expand this a little bit here. So the idea is any action that you choose to take, anything that you deliberately do, voluntarily do, you do it because there's something that you want and you have a certain set of beliefs about the world. So belief here does not have to have a religious connotation, though that would be one of your beliefs, right? Belief here refers to your overall idea of what reality is like. And that includes, for example, how to get what you want. What's the most efficient way to get the thing that you want? If it's a particular action that you believe, then you'll take that action. So try to think about this a little bit. See if you think of counter examples to this, because once you understand belief in this very general way of anything that involves your ideas about what the world is like, your map of reality. And desire is just anything you want, but it can also be something more like something you value. So it doesn't just have to be a physical desire. It could also be something like wanting to be a good person. So, for example, you believe that there's a cat up in the tree. You believe that the best way to get that cat down is to climb up there and get it and bring it back down. You believe that it's a good and kind thing to do. You believe that even though it might be a bit risky to climb up the tree, you think that the value of rescuing the kitten outweighs the value of staying safe. And then you take the action. So the good kitten rescuer who does it deliberately, we explain their action in terms of what they believed and wanted, what they valued, and what they thought the world was like. Every action can be analyzed in this way. At least conscious actions, but that's the only ones that we're really interested in, right? So a sneeze, for example, is not an action that's a result of a belief or a desire. It's only those free will actions that we're talking about. Those ones are caused by your beliefs about the world and what it is that you want. What is driving you, right? You think about that a little bit. Really just think about your own life and your particular choices that you make. If it's a conscious, deliberate choice, then it's going to involve the way that you see the world, as well as what you want out of the world, what you want out of life, how you want to behave, that sort of a thing. Yeah. But your beliefs and your desires are out of your control. At least ultimately, right? There's a way you might have thought of an objection. But think about this for a little bit. Okay, so first of all, well, where do you get your beliefs and your desires to start with? The answer seems to be, well, it's how you're already wired, right? We know a lot about this now. Genetics, we understand how much genetics influences your personality or what you're good at, what sort of stuff you like, right? Look at a simple way in which genetics can influence you as a person. Oh, look at my glasses, right? This is due to genetics. I've got bad eyesight. Well, the way that I am in the world is changed by having these glasses all the time. And this has changed my psychological profile in some way. It had an effect. That's just a small one, but there's much bigger ones in terms of, there's even things like how patient you are, how quickly you get angry at something, all sorts of things that have to do with your genetics. And then, of course, also the circumstances that you grew up in. What kind of a person you are now is largely a function of the life that you've led. Right? Your psychological profile now, this person that you are now, with your beliefs and desires, was caused by the life that you've led, was caused by all your experiences. Somebody else, if they had exactly your experiences, would still turn out different because other people are wired differently, right? So how you come into the world is going to be a large determining factor as well. What else would explain it? What else would explain your beliefs and your desires? Is there anything else? This seems to be the answer. And even if this is not the answer, you still have to understand that if we believe that there are explanations for your beliefs and desires, it's still going to ultimately be outside of your control. Okay, let me restate some of this again. What type of behavior you engage in, what kind of choices you make, is itself determined by your psychological profile. By things like your beliefs about the world, your desires, your personality. All those things ultimately are what drives your intentional behavior. But your psychological profile is ultimately out of your control. Again, what kind of person you are right now has to do with the experiences that you've had so far. What kind of family did you grow up with? What sort of experiences did you have in high school and after high school? What sort of experiences have you had with other people? What have you learned? Or what do you know about the world? Or what do you think you know about the world? All these different factors have to do with what kind of life you've led so far. And what you end up believing can be a function of your personality, which again is largely determined by your genetics. So some people are more likely to believe far-fetched claims, right? Some people are more ready to believe superstitions, for example. That has to do with what kind of person you are, but that ends up determining the beliefs that you have about the world. And then those beliefs end up determining your behavior. So the exception that I was, the objection that I was talking about is that you could point out that we can actually change our beliefs and our desires. So there's some sense in which you can control your beliefs and desires from here on out, as it were. Right? Especially, desires. If, for example, if you have some sort of desire that you don't want to have, right? This can happen in the case of addiction, for example. Best case scenario for an addict is they are able to get the desire to go away, right? The desire to use our method example, right? Tie it all back into that. That person, maybe you can do some cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Where the idea is that you can actually target certain desires and at least maybe diminish them or get rid of them altogether. So you can do something about your beliefs and desires, but will you? Well, lots of people don't. Lots of people just sort of assume that if you have a strong proclivity for something, then it's always going to be that way. Or maybe they'll try a little bit to change it, but it's really hard, so they stop. So what determines whether or not you actually do it? What determines whether or not you actually work and successfully change your beliefs or your desires? Yeah, so sometimes it happens, but then we still go back to, well, what kind of person are you? What kind of person has history produced when it comes to you? Right? When it comes to the combination of your unique genetic makeup and your unique personal history, that's what's going to determine your psychological profile, and that's what's going to determine whether or not you end up changing your beliefs and desires. So there's a sense in which ultimately it's still out of your control. Ultimately, a lot of this stuff is determined by what sort of genetics you had and what kind of upbringing you had. You know, think about this for a little bit, because I do think it's a bit mind-blowing if you think about this for a little bit. Can you really get out of this? People try to get out of this with examples like, well, how do you explain the person who had a really rough upbringing? Let's say there's two brothers who grew up in the same difficult household with an abusive parent or something, or they were exposed to a lot of crime, were in unsafe situations, and maybe they both have some PTSD or something. One of them sort of predictably does not break out of this pattern, becomes involved in crime themselves, becomes an abusive person. But the other brother somehow gets out of this life and turns a new leaf and does something positive with their lives. How can you explain that? Well, it's not really that much of an objection, because that person, the good brother, let's put it that way, right? They will have a different genetic makeup from the other brother, and even though their life experiences are similar, they're not going to be identical. So there's two different ways that the end result can be influenced in terms of the psychological profile. Right? Two different ways. I mean, think about it. Is there no explanation for why the good brother turned over, started over and chose a different kind of life? There's got to be some reason, right? It's got to be either something like, well, they're just temperamentally different, and temperament can be explained genetically. Or maybe they came across some good advice, or maybe they found a good book that really changed their ideas and their beliefs about the world. Right? I bet you if you sat both of these brothers down and talked to them, you'd get something out of it. You'd start understanding just why the other brother got out of this life, right? This sort of negative life of crime and abuse, and throw everything in there, drug abuse, right? It's just, yeah. So it's not really a counterexample to say that, well, sometimes people with bad backgrounds get out of that lifestyle. Yeah, that's true, but why do they get out of that lifestyle? It's going to depend on what kind of person they are. It's going to depend on what beliefs they've acquired, what kind of desires they have, what kind of temperament they have. And those things are still ultimately out of their control. Right? So if this is right, then it's just, that brother was really just kind of luckier. They could still be, maybe we still want to praise them, say, well, what a inspiring story. That's great. It just shows that even if you have a bad background, you can still make something out of your life, and that's all positive and everything. But in the ultimate reckoning, when you really put it all together, you realize that brother just sort of got lucky. That they were the kind of person who would try to pursue something different, who could see the possibility of something different, who could see a way to change their life, who actually has the desire to change their life. It's ultimately going to come down to their beliefs and desires again. And those beliefs and desires are ultimately out of your control. This is where I really miss interaction, right? Because this should be a dialogue, right? I want to hear your thoughts about this. Fortunately, that's not possible like this. But so think about this on your own for a little bit. Pause this. Try to parse what we're trying to say here. Right? This is not just my argument. This is just a general sort of general way of looking at human behavior. If you really think about what determines, what explains human behavior, when it comes to intentional, voluntary behavior, it is your beliefs and your desires. Where belief, again, means your overall thoughts about what the world is like, and your desires, meaning what you want, but that can include things like being a good person, right? So desire doesn't just mean some sort of immediate physical gratification desire. It can mean something much more noble than that as well, right? What is your behavior like? What sort of choices do you make? That depends on what kind of person you are. What determines what kind of person you are? Your beliefs, your desires, and maybe something like temperament, if we want to include that. Or would you just say shorthand, your overall psychological profile. Your psychological profile determines your behavior. But what determines your psychological profile? It's a combination of your genetics and your personal history. Okay. So this is saying that all your behavior is causally necessitated by your psychological states. Okay. And your psychological states are ultimately outside of your control. Ultimately, right? Always remember ultimately, because again, I know you want to say something like, no, wait, but I can control my psychological state. If I'm feeling really angry, for example, I can count backwards from 10 to 0 and take some deep breaths, and I can change my mental state. Yeah, you do have that kind of control. That's true. But of course, whether or not you actually do that, what explains that, right? What distinguishes you from the person who is not able to calm down? You have to then answer again, well, it's my psychological profile. That's the sort of person I am. I learned how to do this. Right? Maybe your parents taught you how to do that, or your kindergarten teacher. Someone had this positive influence on your life. And maybe temperamentally, you're the type of person for whom this works. For other people, that might not work. For other people, they might count backwards from 10 to 0, but nothing happens. Right? So yes, you can change your mental states and your psychological profile, but whether you do that or how you do that is ultimately going to be outside of your control. Ultimately, it's going to be a function of your genetics, the way you're wired, and the personal experiences that you've had. Okay, so that's 3 different arguments for determinism. If you're not convinced by any of them, I'd love to know why. Right? Now, notice so far we haven't actually said anything about free will being a myth or an illusion, right? I haven't really mentioned free will in here, right? But maybe you can see that at the very least, determinism seems to be perhaps in conflict with the idea of free will, because this seems to be saying that your behavior in some sense is ultimately outside of your control. Right? But that was one of the necessary conditions for an action being free will, right? Is that it's under your control, that you could have done otherwise. But this is saying, given your psychological states at a particular point in time when you make a decision, well, the decision just naturally flows out of that psychological state. And that psychological state itself was determined by other events, by other factors. Okay. Well, here's 4. This is not, well, yeah, it's an argument 4, but it's sort of a rhetorical argument, right? What would the world be like if determinism was false? Again, if determinism means that every event has an explanation in terms of other events that cause that event to happen, what would the alternative look like? Well, just events just pop into being without any real explanation? There's just uncaused events? That sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? Some things just happen without any causal explanation? Or your behavior has nothing to do with your genetics or environment? Maybe you're tempted towards this, but as the previous argument said, your genetics and your environment are what explains your psychological profile, your psychological states. And your psychological states are what determine your behavior, at least your intentional behavior. So it's hard to get out of this, I think. But at the very least, look at these two. Right? If determinism is false, then there would be uncaused events. Things would just happen without any causal explanation. That doesn't seem to be the case. So it seems to follow then that determinism must be true. Because the alternative to determinism seems weirder than determinism itself. Okay, now I'm going to break this up so you don't have to watch like a 3-hour thing. Okay, so let me do a little bit more though. Okay, so far we've looked at free will, what we think it is, and we think it involves doing things on purpose, deliberately, being able to choose from different choices, and also you could have chosen something different than what you did choose. That's what we associate with free will. And free will is related to morality, for sure. If someone did something of their own free will, then we can blame them or praise them for their actions. If it was not the result of their own free will, then it's not an action that we evaluate morally. Right? So we're used to this distinction between free will actions and non-free will actions because we rely on that distinction when we hold one another accountable for actions. And we do that, right? I just want to reiterate that. Sometimes it can all sound so abstract, but you do this. You hold other people accountable. You say, that was messed up what you did. Fill in the blanks here. You can think of your own example, okay? That was messed up what you did. You shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. Add to that we typically then assume that they could have done something different, right? We might add and say, you didn't have to do that, you know. You could have just avoided that course of action altogether. But the fact that you chose that out of all the alternatives, that shows something bad about you, right? Maybe that shows I can't trust you or whatever it is. But if we think that their behavior couldn't have been otherwise, then we might go easy on them. If their behavior was caused, for example, by a neurological disease, right, or something else, then we might be more forgiving. If we come to the conclusion that they didn't mean to do it, or it wasn't a free will action, or something else caused them, well, that makes a big difference. Okay, so we had free will, the relationship between free will and morality, and then we looked at determinism. Okay. So now we get to incompatibilism, which is a stance on free will and determinism. And it says they can't both be true. So you can be an incompatibilist in two different ways, of course, right? You can say they can't both be true, so free will is true, or you can say they can't both be true, so determinism is true. So there's two different ways of being an incompatibilist. Okay, here's an argument. Just laid out in premise conclusion form, and I copied it, so I'm making sure to cite my sources here, right? Because I actually copied this directly. Okay. If determinism is true, then all events, including human actions, are causally necessitated by prior states of the universe in accordance with the laws of nature. I mean, this is pretty much the definition of determinism that we looked at, right? This intuitive idea that human actions, all events, have causal explanations, physical explanations. Premise 2 says, if human actions are causally necessitated by the past, then we cannot do otherwise than what we do. Right? There wouldn't be alternate possibilities. Right? So I might think that it's a choice between apple pie and pecan pie. I might think that I'm making a free will choice to go for the pecan pie, let's say. No one made me do it. I could have chosen the apple pie. It was a choice that was available to me. In that sense. But if my actions are causally necessitated by the past, that means I wouldn't ever choose the apple pie. It's not a real alternate possibility. If my choosing the pecan pie is causally necessitated, then that's the only outcome that could obtain. Nothing else could have happened. So then there wouldn't be alternate possibilities. I couldn't have done otherwise on this view. And if we can't act otherwise than what we do, then we lack free will. Remember, that was one of the criteria for free will. Being able to have done otherwise. That sounds weird. Being able to have done otherwise. I think that's right, though. You could have done otherwise. You could have made a different choice. But if everything's necessitated, if everything is determined by the past, then there is no alternate possibility. I only ever would have chosen the pecan pie. Well, what does that all mean? Well, simply put, it means that if determinism is true, then we lack free will, right? So if determinism is true, then all events are causally determined. If all events are causally determined, then there are no alternate possibilities. If there are no alternate possibilities, there's no free will. So that means, right, it's a good argument. It's a valid argument. If all the premises are true, then the conclusion follows. So this is the main argument for incompatibilism. And as you can see, it mostly has to do with this idea of alternate possibilities. Right? That free will must involve alternate possibilities, but determinism seems to rule that out. So determinism seems to rule out free will. Okay? So this is not a position for determinism. It's not an argument for free will. It is simply an argument for the idea that they're incompatible with one another. Yeah? That's all it really is. Okay, I hope that's pretty clear. I'll bring up that ambiguity again with alternate possibilities, right? If human actions are causally necessitated by the past, then we cannot do otherwise than what we do. We can't choose otherwise. Is that really true? Is this premise really true? Because in one reading, it's not true, right? Because look, go back to the pecan and apple pie choice. If we rewind the tape of time to that crucial moment where I chose pecan pie, could I have chosen apple pie instead? Well, in one sense, even if you're a determinist, you could say yes, if your mental state had been different. If you had wanted apple pie, if you liked apple pie more and you didn't like pecan pie at all, then that was a choice available to you. There was some apple pie right there on the table and some pecan pie on the table. So could have done otherwise. It's ambiguous here. Do you mean you could have done otherwise even if your psychological state had been exactly the same? Or does that just mean you could have done otherwise if you had wanted something different? If your psychological profile was different? Then yeah, you could have done otherwise because there was an apple pie there. I could have chosen that. But this premise here does not distinguish which of those senses we mean. Okay? So this is going to come back again later. It's just a very important issue throughout all of this, so I'm going to keep bringing that up. And really, the whole controversy, I think, has a lot to do with how we interpret alternate possibilities. These two different ways. Rewind time to the crucial moment of choice. Could you have chosen otherwise if your mental states had been exactly the same? If you had wanted apple pie or pecan pie still, and you saw no reason to choose apple pie, just like you did the first time, could you then suddenly turn around and choose the apple pie instead, even though your psychological state was completely the same? Yes or no? That's one question. The other question is, could you have chosen otherwise if your mental state had been different? Here the answer is much more obviously yes. If we rewind time, but this time we imagine that my mental state was slightly different. This time I desired apple pie. That's what I wanted in this scenario. Could I act on that desire? Yeah, an apple pie is available. So I could have done otherwise. I did not have to choose the pecan pie. I could have chosen the apple pie, but only if my mental states had been different. Two different ways of reading the alternate possibilities. Okay, I'll do one more thing here, and let's relate that consequence argument that I just gave to moral responsibility, so we can expand that argument a little bit. Here's the principle of alternate possibilities that I spelled out earlier. We're only morally responsible for actions that could have been otherwise. If determinism is true, then our actions could never have been otherwise. Again, because each action would be causally determined by what happened prior. If determinism is true, then we are never morally responsible for our actions. You see this? So the argument first said, if determinism is true, there's no free will. But now it's saying, since free will is required for moral responsibility, that means that if determinism is true, we're not really morally responsible for anything. If determinism is true, and every event, every choice that you make is completely causally determined, it could not have been otherwise, and then there's some intuitive sense in which that does seem to mean that maybe we're not morally responsible for our actions. After all, if it's not really up to us what actions we take, if it's ultimately outside of our control, then how can we be morally blamed or praised for any of it? It's all just, it's as though from the very beginning of the universe, it was already determined what you are going to end up doing. Right? Given the state of the universe at the very beginning of the Big Bang, everything sort of falls out of that. So how can we hold people morally responsible if that's the picture that we're looking at? And there's something intuitive about that, right? This is why determinism seems to be kind of a threatening thing. Because on the one hand, determinism seems to be correct, but on the other hand, if it is correct, then it seems to have these huge consequences in terms of how we think about morality and how we think about moral responsibility. So it's a huge issue. Right? So not only is determinism not compatible with free will, it's also not compatible with moral responsibility on this view. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. So we got all the way to this circle right here. That's not bad, right? Hopefully that wasn't too painfully boring. Do think about these issues. It's a lot to take in. Right, so just to review, free will means doing something deliberately on purpose, meaning to, being able to choose from different possibilities. But then also the idea that you have to have alternate possibilities seems to be built into our concept of free will. But of course, what we mean by alternate possibilities can be spelled out in two different ways. Right? The way that I describe it is you rewind time to the moment of your decision. One way says even if your psychological state is exactly the same at that moment, you could have chosen something different. The other way of interpreting is, if we rewind time and we imagine that you have a slightly different psychological profile, different desires or beliefs, then you could have made a different choice. Okay, then it's free will, right? So two different ways of thinking about that. Then we saw how free will ties in with morality. It seems to be a necessary condition for morality, right? It seems to be the case that we need this concept to distinguish between moral actions and non-moral actions. Right? Non-moral actions, something like sneezing, right? We don't praise or blame someone for that. It's completely beyond their control. But if someone means to do something, and they did it intentionally and they weren't forced to, then we're going to hold them morally accountable, either praising them for something good or blaming them for something bad. So these seem to be tied with one another. But then along comes determinism, and determinism, the idea that all events are causally necessitated by the past. That seems to rule out at least one of the senses in which free will requires alternate possibilities. Notice it's fine with that second sense of alternate possibilities, where we're just imagining, well, if your mental state had been slightly different, of course it wasn't, right? Your mental state at that point was completely determined by the past, a determinist would say. But if we're playing this sort of a mind game, or sort of a thought experiment, well, what if at that moment, instead of desiring pecan pie, you desired apple pie? Could you have chosen apple pie instead? If the answer is yes, then yeah, you had free will with regard to which pie you chose, because both choices were available to you. It's just whichever one that you wanted, right? In one scenario, you want the apple pie and you get it. The other one, you don't. You want the pecan pie and you get it, right? So that sense of alternate possibilities is compatible with determinism. What's not compatible is this idea that you could be in the exact same psychological state and yet choose something different. That's the stronger sense of alternate possibilities. Okay, so we had that, and then we have incompatibilism making the argument that because determinism rules out that stronger sense of alternate possibilities, it must not be compatible with free will, and therefore it must not be compatible with morality either. Right? So the incompatibilists, at least the Watson argument, says that, well, if determinism is not compatible with free will, then it's also not going to be compatible with morality either. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to see the problems here. It's a lot to figure out. Next, we are going to look at the position that we do have free will, and that therefore determinism is false. Then we'll look at the position that says, no, determinism is true. Okay, it's free will that's the problem. We don't really have free will. Free will is just an illusion. And then the compatibilist is going to say that basically, I mean, the way that I'm going to present the argument is that the incompatibilist is wrong thinking that determinism and free will are not compatible due to the alternate possibilities idea. The compatibilist is going to say all we need for morality and for free will is that weaker sense of alternate possibilities, where if your psychological state had been different, you could have chosen differently. Right? That idea is going to be compatible with the idea that everything is determined. That might not all be clear right now, but hopefully it will be. And hopefully at least you understand the logical possibilities here, right? You know, you could be an incompatibilist and think only one of these could be true, so you'll be a libertarian or a hard determinist. Or you could be a compatibilist and say, no, conceptually these are consistent. We just need to think really what we mean by some of the things involved in our analysis of the concept of free will. And then we'll see that the right way of conceptualizing free will is actually compatible with determinism and compatible with our ordinary moral evaluations and things like that. Okay, I'm going to stop it here. Whether or not I stop it here is completely determined by my mental state right now, and my mental state is completely determined by what's happened throughout my entire life up until now. Okay, so this is inevitable.